Hello world civilization students, Mr. Lassiter here with you, and in this video we're going to be thinking about empires in decline, specifically how the Roman Empire came to its end. For our video goals questions, we want to first think generally about the factors that contribute to the decline and collapse of empires. Then we want to think more specifically about how these apply to the Roman Empire and its fall in 476 CE. And then we also want to consider what is the legacy of the Roman Empire, though it has many. Let's go ahead and get started by thinking about contributing factors to the decline of empires. Every empire goes through pretty much the same cycle. We see a state form, and then we see that state expand. It reaches a height or a golden age, and eventually it overextends, and it begins a decline. And some of the factors that contribute to this decline include political corruption, right? A corruption in the political system. This could be poor leadership. It could just be deterioration that could result from poor leadership. For example, instead of people looking to the emperor for answers, they might look to local leaders or military generals. Excuse me. We call this decentralization of the empire because it is becoming less centralized as people start to rely on local leaders. Another thing that we see sometimes with empires is that they sometimes, at times, overextend their borders. Controlling a larger territory certainly is much more expensive and it is difficult to control. So there is, in some cases, a tipping point for how large your empire should be. Outside forces, of course, can play a major role in the decline of empires. Whether it's invasion or migration or just simply warfare. And some empires have no control over how they decline. Sometimes environmental challenges come into play. You could have droughts or food shortages that could lead to a decline in population or dissatisfaction of peasants and lead to rebellions. It could be diseases and epidemics. So those are things, of course, that an empire doesn't have much control over. However, they could indicate whether or not you have a legitimate government if you are in China or something along those lines. Of course, economic problems play a major role. Sometimes resources can become scarce, or you might have taxation problems. And oftentimes we see in empires as they decline, a growing wealth gap between people who are very rich and very poor. And then the last thing, which would be tough to define, is the cultural conflict that can come in a large empire. There might be religious differences or declines in innovation and technology, which weaken an empire and make it susceptible to decline. I also want to point out that not all of these things occur in every empire that falls. Oftentimes you might see combinations of these things or one that outweighs the others. So keep that in mind as you continue your study of empires. Now we'll look more specifically at the Roman Empire. And we're going to start by thinking about what political corruption and deterioration looked like in Rome. Well, Roman leadership weakened over a very long period of time. We see this really beginning in the 2nd century, but in the 3rd century or the 200s, it really takes off. We have something called the 3rd century crisis in Rome. So there are problems of succession or naming the successor to be emperor. There are frequent assassinations. For example, in one 50-year period in the 3rd century, there were 26 different emperors of Rome, and all but one died of unnatural causes. And at times you have ruthless leaders of Rome, leaders that are assassinated perhaps because they are so harsh in how they rule this territory. But another thing we see in Rome is that it eventually decentralizes. This Roman Empire that is formed under the leadership of Augustus brings all power under his single leadership. This starts to break down, and people, as we look at some of the other problems Rome has coming up here in a second, people start to turn to their local leaders with local concerns. Instead of worrying about invasions halfway across the empire, people are worried about, let's say, getting food on their table, and they turn to the local aristocracy to solve these problems. And as people turn to local influences, they start to rely less and less on that centralized government, effectively weakening it. Another thing that we see in Rome is the overextension of borders. Rome certainly grows to be so large that it just becomes too expensive to defend. Eventually, its borders will be compromised by invasions, and that just simply will be very expensive. That'll lead to raising taxes in Rome, which, of course, the people won't like very much. And the empire does try to manage this. Diocletian, the emperor of Rome, splits the empire into two governing zones, the east and the west, as you've heard in your overview video. But really, it's just too little too late. This overextension leads to financial problems and eventually the decentralization of that western portion of the empire. And a lot of that is due to outside forces. Oftentimes, people consider this to be the single greatest reason for the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. But of course, all of these things are still debated by historians. So this outside migration into the Roman Empire is really started from Central Asia. There's a group called the Huns who, through some environmental forces, start to migrate westward. And this pushes different groups of tribes, which we kind of classify as just Germanic tribes. They are pushed westward into the territory that Rome controls. And these Germanic tribes raid the lands of Rome. So they might raid cities or the city of Rome itself, or just communities. Of course, that also becomes very expensive to defend. There's a lot of different groups here. The Franks, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals. All of these make the defense of Roman borders and Roman cities very difficult. Rome is plundered actually more than once in the 400s, but the Western Roman Empire officially comes to an end in 476 when a Germanic king conquers Rome and sets up his own kingdom in Italy. Now, another reason why Rome is weakening is because it dealt with some of these environmental challenges that they had no control over. There are several disease epidemics, especially that are particularly destructive for Rome. For example, the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian, I think in the 3rd century. They result in millions of people dying of smallpox and measles. One piece of data said that in the Plague of Cyprian at its height, over 5,000 people were dying per day. What this meant is that Rome had fewer people to work the fields, and so you're going to deal with food shortages. They're going to have fewer soldiers to defend the empire. There's going to be less tax money because you don't have as many people working who you can get to pay you taxes. And generally, you're going to get more chaos. People are going to start to be disillusioned with the Roman Empire, again, looking more toward their local communities rather than the empire as a whole. Along with these challenges of overextension of borders and these invasions and environmental challenges come economic problems. Of course, I've already talked a little bit about the heavy tax burden on the population, but Rome also has a stagnant economy. They're dealing with an over-reliance on slave labor. So when Rome stops conquering new territory to replenish their slave population, they have a difficulty producing the same amount of goods that they had in the past. Small farmers end up having to sell their land to large landowners in order to pay their taxes. And so small farms start to disappear, which means you have a lot of people who are in poverty. This widening wealth gap basically sees the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So the poor, of course, start to think that this aristocracy in Rome doesn't care about them, and thus why should they fight to support the Roman Empire? So some psychological effects there, I think, as well. And the last thing we see in Rome, of course, is the cultural conflicts. This is one that you may know a little bit about. Christianity versus traditional Roman beliefs. Christianity was a growing religion in the Roman Empire, and for a time it was persecuted by the Roman authorities. In fact, Christians were blamed for the plagues that existed in Rome, but it continued to grow as a religion, especially among those lower classes. Eventually, the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, and we see kind of a push to have more people convert to the religion. In fact, under Emperor Theodosius, later on, Christianity is made the only acceptable religion in Rome. Some other cultural conflicts are that rich versus poor conflict that we see, the upper class living extravagant lifestyles. There are some historians who claim that one of the reasons Rome declined is because it had a decline in morality. And of course, the lower classes were not happy with these extravagant lifestyles when they were living in poverty, which leads to even greater conflict. And then the last thing that we see is that art and architecture, that innovation and technology that had really come to define Roman history, really just dries up. Rome stops creating these new artistic styles, which is maybe perhaps more symbolic of their decline than causing it, but nevertheless still noteworthy. So what was the legacy of the Roman Empire? Of course, we still talk about it to this day. So even with these weakening, these areas of weakness, when the Roman Empire declines, it still leaves quite a remarkable legacy. In Western Europe, we're going to enter what we call the Middle Ages. And Western Europe, for the most part, except for a small time period in the 800s, will mostly exist of small feudal kingdoms, decentralized states that are very isolated from one another. So that regionalism and that decentralization occurs at a major scale, and Europe will never truly reunite again like it had under the Roman Empire. But in the East, of course, the Roman legacy lives on with the Byzantine Empire, which continues until 1453. And later states and empires still, to this day, try to connect themselves to Rome. If you look at the architecture of Washington, D.C. in the United States, it is a Greco-Roman style, again, trying to connect the United States to those great, to the great legacy of specifically the Roman Republic, but the Empire of Rome. And of course, there is a cultural legacy. Rome is the home, or serves as a home for the rise of Christianity. Latin-based languages across Europe are based on the Roman language of Latin. Roman art, architecture, and technology is still studied to this day. And Roman law becomes the basis for most laws in Europe, even after the empire declines. This is just the tip of the iceberg for the legacy of Rome, but it's worth thinking about that when an empire declines, its influence does not necessarily go away. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed looking at the factors for the decline and collapse of empires, and specifically the Roman Empire. Have a good day.